Shanti Sumartoyo, and this is
Stacey Holman Jones.
And today we're going to talk about autoethnography in research. So Stacey, I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you and get the benefit of your expertise today. Can we start off by letting me ask you, why would you use autoethnography in a research project as opposed to another type of methodology?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. So one of the things that autoethnography is really good at is getting to the very specific, concrete, granular aspects of experience, getting at the everyday, and also getting to embodied elements, so practice and practical approaches. So while some research methodologies are really good at giving us a kind of general description of a phenomenon and dealing with large data sets, for example, so quantitative studies, demographic studies, etc. Autoethnography is really good at getting us that kind of specific view. So it's great to use in combination with quantitative methodologies because it gives us that specificity, sometimes serving as an example to support a kind of overarching claim, or it also can give us a kind of zoom in view of a particular practice or activity. So it's not a kind of either or proposition, but when you're really wanting to get at that detail and that nuance, it's a really good methodology for that. It's also really good methodology when we're thinking about sense making and story as a sense making activity. So because it focuses on people's experience and the experiential, and it focuses on how people make sense of that experience in the context of their lives, it's a great combination with theoretical concepts. So one of the things that that I always say about autoethnography is that while theory might be a kind of abstract representation of a concept or a way of thinking about a phenomenon, what autoethnography does is bring that specificity to that abstraction so that we can understand it in some kind of relief or some kind of context.
Yeah, and you can also imagine how that kind of specificity and the sort of detail, especially detail around the everyday, connects really well to design practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which has a similar concern with the stuff of the everyday.
Yeah. And while it might be a little bit of a kind of misnomer, the autoethnography or the graphy, the kind of written element, and certainly there are beautiful written autoethnographies, there are a lot of autoethnographic modalities that get us to embodiment. And so I always think of design as a highly embodied practice that's thinking about the senses and the material. And autoethnographic's great because of that granularity with the everyday and the interest in it.
So I want to move on now to talk a little bit about reflexivity, because this is, I mean, in any ethnographic research, this is a key concept. As researchers, we are in a research encounter of some sort in which we play a role. Like, we are making these worlds, we're a part of the worlds that we're researching as well. And certainly this is, really, especially the case when it comes to autoethnography. This is also a core concept for designers who are thinking about their own subjectivity as they're doing their work. But autoethnography is where we see it highlighted in very particular ways. So can you talk a little bit about what reflexivity means in the context of autoethnography, and maybe how it's played out in some of the work that you've done or that others have done?
Yeah. I mean, it is in addition to that kind of specificity and concreteness and connection to the experiential, the reflexivity part of the autoethnographic project is central. So if we think about ethnography and the ways in which ethnographers needed to grapple with their own positioning in relation to the insights that they were generating, which is sometimes referred to as the crisis of representation in ethnography. And getting, really grappling with the idea of being an objective, authoritative observer of a culture,
Mm.
And using social science to kind of get at that. Autoethnography really embraced the subjectivity of the researcher, the embeddedness of the researcher, and really tried to use that not as a disclaimer. One of the things about reflexivity is that while we might, as researchers, we always want to claim our position in relation to the research. Why are we interested in it? How have we been involved in creating it and constructing it? Autoethnography really uses reflexivity as a kind of motor or a generator. And it's really about a kind of ongoing relationship of reflexivity in the work, rather than something that you kind of address and then move on from. It's really this kind of centerpiece of the work. So that's one of the things that I really love about the autoethnographic project. And we've developed, autoethnographers have developed different ways of talking about that. And you can see the ethics of that practice are foregrounded. So sometimes ethnographers and autoethnographers are collaborators with participants, or they use what's called collaborative autoethnography. My colleague has developed an approach that they call collaborative witnessing in her work with Holocaust survivors. So they're in constant conversation about their positions vis-a-vis the research. In my own work, for example, I've written about identity politics in my relationship with my father, who is, he had a stroke when right as I was coming out. And so we were both negotiating these shifts in our identities, but it's been a really interesting context for me to think about reflexivity with someone like my dad, whose memory is quite altered. And so one of the things that happens when I talk to him is we sort of re-engage with one another every time we meet. And it's really kind of foregrounded reflexivity for me in those kinds of very personal ways as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how, just as you were, saying in the response to the first question, how autoethnography can connect theory to kind of everyday lived experience, that reflexivity is a thread that kind of, traces through that connection between theory and concepts, like identity, for example, and this kind of lived reality. And I'm also really struck by what you're saying about how reflexivity is an ongoingly kind of emergent part of how you're always thinking in your research processes, and that there's a kind of an ethics to this. It's about a sort of research integrity and responsibility to yourself and to your participants.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it is interesting, there are some authors in this field who've written about that ethical responsibility to the self as a researcher. So sort of really contrary to the idea that autoethnography is, sometimes people say it's me search. What I think it's a really radical, I mean, I've argued that it's really we search, it's really in search of community, but you might just turn that the way around and think that it's a really radical interrogation of what kinds of effects research has on researchers, which is really not something that we're great about talking about. Yeah. So I think it's a really important prompt for us to consider all of the ethical implications of those relationships when we're doing research.
So what about the different kinds of forms, and how do you make decisions about, when you're designing a research project that has a strong autoethnographic component, how do you make good decisions about what form that takes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And in addition to some of those kind of relational and ethical concerns, as well as some of those commitments I talked about initially, so a commitment to trying to engage with the really specific and concrete and everyday, trying to engage with embodiment in a kind of fully sensorial way. The thing that really excites me about doing autoethnographic work is that it really does ask us to pay attention to what I might describe as the performative element of our research. So I always think about form in relation to the performative, and that is the form should really be dictated or governed. Those are kind of strong words, but it really should be guided by the content and the context that you're working in. So you'll see auto-ethnographic work that's quite, that's literary, that sometimes uses a fictive mode, that's really focused in on storytelling and the language that we use. And that's something I'm quite interested in as in my engagement with theory as another kind of text. But you'll also see auto-ethnographic forms that are, that work in the visual realm. So we've got visual auto-ethnography, visual arts, textile arts, performance modes, sound auto-ethnography, and it really does frame, the form gets framed by the inquiry itself, which I find really exciting. So for people like designers, this is a really exciting opportunity because they can take that material form that so much of design does, or a social and relational form as well.
I've only ever thought of doing autoethnography one way, myself, but I can imagine as a designer, your design practice can be part of how you're conducting your autoethnographic inquiry, and the materials that are generated through that process are sort of materials that are completely entangled in both the concepts and the empirics of the work that you're doing. Yeah, that's really fascinating. And there's also a kind of a empathetic route there to other people's experiences through your own manipulation of materials or performance or whatever it is. Yeah.
And people can come together around their practice, whatever that practice might be, and I've seen creations of really beautiful collaborative texts. Karen Werner, who's a radio broadcaster sound artist, who makes auto-ethnographic work, teamed up with one of my performance studies colleagues, and they made this really beautiful hybrid audio piece that's really a bridge between performance practice and radio broadcast. And so you can really see them coming into the fullness of that form in a really collective way. So there are a lot of opportunities to expand and explore in that realm.
Yeah, yeah. So this leads me to my final question, which is what autoethnography can do for us analytically. So we've started to touch on this a bit, how there are different, how it can connect theory and empirics, the sort of threads, we started to investigate the kind of tendrils where things can connect.
Yes.
So do you have any, sort of thoughts on how autoethnography can connect concepts and empirics in research processes?
Yeah. I mean, I do. There's a lot to say about this, but when I was thinking about the question, I kept coming back to my own practice and my own research. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So my work, I mean, I would really classify the work that I do as critical autoethnography because I have an interest in and a commitment to the critical project, and critical theory is a really central part of the work that I do. So in my own practice, one of the things that autoethnography is particularly helpful with is thinking through theoretical frameworks and concepts. So for example, power dynamics or the constitution of gendered identities or race identities or intersectionality, or even the post-human, and working through those ideas in conversation and relation to personal experience. So one of the things I tell researchers, and this is just a great way for me to get going, is I look quite closely at the language of theory, even and really sometimes even transcribing bits of that as a way to kind of work through my own understanding. And I kind of work between or tack between that and a kind of more personal storytelling, talking through my own experience in relation to that. And it sets up a kind of great dynamic where I'm thinking through my own experience in relation to the theory. So to get back to my example of my dad post-stroke, me post-coming out, I was reading Judith Butler's book called Giving an Account of Oneself, which is really about how the constitution of identity is a relational proposition. It happens in relations to others. It doesn't happen just sort of inside of yourself. And I was really trying to think through those concepts inside of the context of my dad and I coming to know each other as quite different people, because we'd had these breaks in our identities. So the theory was really the motor for the story, and the story really became the motor for the theory. And I always tell writers, if you keep at that sort of dynamic long enough, then you see the connections start to form. And it allows me to talk about what the intervention of theory might be in the personal, but it also lets me talk about what the intervention of the personal might be in the theoretical. So that's one example. You could apply that to your own practice. I work with actors and they think about their acting practice in relation to theater theory, and that's another great way to understand how those things work in tandem and relationally and in really entangled and interesting ways. I think the task is to find structures that help us work those dynamics. So for me, it's thinking about writing structures that help me work across, but those things could also be quite embodied, or they could be sensory investigations that help us work those dynamics as well.
And that plays really well to the strengths of design, which are about, you know, in many cases, processes of making, of, you know, ideation, of iteration, you know, of prototyping, which are, you know, which have a kind of a structure and a logic that, you know, I could see sort of being woven into these kinds of processes in really productive ways.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, great. Stacey Holman-Jones, thank you so much for this lovely chat. And thank you for watching our video on autoethnography.